There are those among us who do not run from love because they don't need it, but because they once needed it too deeply and were met with pain instead of presence. To understand the avoidant is not to chase them, heal them, or pull them closer, but to witness them silently, patiently, and without demand, and in doing so, offer the only kind of love they have ever been able to trust. An avoidant individual moves through life wearing armor that was forged in childhood, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Beneath the cool distance and emotional restraint is not indifference, but a history, often unspoken, of love feeling unsafe, suffocating, or conditional. They learned early on that vulnerability is a gamble, and connection too often came at the cost of autonomy. So they built walls, not to keep others out entirely, but to preserve the last fragments of self they were taught might be lost in intimacy. These internal boundaries, though invisible, are as real to them as physical borders, and any love that approaches without recognizing this sacred architecture will be met with resistance. The avoidant does not mistrust love because they are incapable of it. They mistrust it because it has too often come in forms that required them to erase parts of themselves just to belong. To them, love that asks for emotional openness without first earning trust feels more like control than connection. What they respond to is not emotional intensity, but emotional safety. They long, in the quietest parts of themselves, for a connection that does not demand their dismantling, a love that respects their need for solitude and the rhythm of their withdrawal without interpreting it as a personal failure. This kind of love doesn't rush past their silence with attempts to fix or decode. It simply waits. It stands at the edge of their world with patience and clarity, never trying to kick down the door, but trusting that when it's safe, they'll open it themselves. It is this deep respect for their emotional territory that awakens in them the first seed of trust. They begin to see that not every expression of love will consume them, and not every person who reaches out to them is trying to take something away. The stillness of this kind of love becomes more powerful than any plea for closeness. It is a paradox they often struggle to articulate. The more freedom they are given, the more intimacy they can eventually offer. But that freedom cannot be performative. It must be authentic. A love that is willing to remain whole on its own allows the avoidant to feel safe enough to finally inch forward. Each step toward closeness feels like a risk, so they need to know that if they retreat, the connection will not be shattered. They need to see that their presence is valued, not extracted, that their pace is not a problem to be solved, but a rhythm to be understood. The respect for boundaries does not mean emotional disconnection. It means emotional maturity. It means loving without overwhelming. The avoidant does not want someone to scale their walls. They want someone who doesn't need to tear them down to feel connected. Only when they feel that their inner landscape is not threatened by intrusion do they slowly begin to trust, and in that slow unveiling, the depth of their love, once hidden, finally begins to surface. Avoidant individuals often exist behind a carefully crafted mask, one shaped by years of emotional adaptation. In their earliest relationships, they may have been subtly or overtly taught that expressing emotion was unsafe, weak, or unwelcome. As a result, they learned to regulate their behavior to survive, constructing an identity that was pleasing, competent, or self-sufficient enough to avoid criticism or rejection. But this curated self becomes their armor, one that both protects and imprisons. Underneath that performance lies the real self, sensitive, uncertain, longing, but rarely allowed to surface for fear of being ridiculed, abandoned, or misunderstood. When love approaches them, the avoidant instinctively scans for judgment, for signs that they will once again be labeled, analyzed, or fixed. They are less afraid of love than they are of being misread by it. The only kind of love that begins to feel trustworthy is the one that sees them beyond this facade and chooses not to dissect them. This love does not use emotional X-rays to determine what's wrong or pathologize their coping mechanisms as broken. It simply witnesses them with calm awareness. The avoidant is perceptive, often attuned to the undercurrents of emotional agendas. They can tell when someone's acceptance is conditional, or when understanding is laced with subtle contempt. They don't need a savior, they need a witness, someone who will look at them and not flinch. Someone who does not treat their silence as a problem or their independence as avoidance. Someone who sees the way they guard their inner world and understands the depth of meaning behind that distance. What draws them in is not emotional analysis, but emotional neutrality, a presence that doesn't distort or diagnose. Love, for them, becomes trustworthy when it says, "I see you," without adding, "and here's what you should do differently." It becomes safe when it does not rush in with advice, corrections, or spiritualized interventions. It becomes healing when it allows them to unfold in their own time, without being interrupted by another person's discomfort with their slowness. They are not asking to be admired, but they are hoping, quietly, that someone will sit with them without needing them to be more than they are. In this kind of presence, they are allowed to exist without managing impressions. They are allowed to be inarticulate without being dismissed, to feel awkward without being accused of coldness. Slowly, this begins to rewrite their internal script. They begin to question whether all connection is invasive, whether all closeness requires sacrifice. The love that sees without judging offers them the rare opportunity to breathe without performing. It teaches them, wordlessly, that intimacy is not synonymous with interrogation. When they begin to trust that they are not being watched to be corrected, but simply seen to be known, a small shift occurs. They begin to show more, risk more, feel more, not because they've been pushed, but because they've been understood. And to an avoidant, that understanding is the purest form of love they've ever known. Avoidant individuals have often internalized the belief that love must be earned through performance. This idea rarely begins as a conscious conviction, but forms over time through countless subtle reinforcements. In childhood or early relationships, they may have been praised only when they were achieving, behaving, or emotionally self-contained. Expressions of raw feeling may have been met with discomfort, dismissal, or punishment. Over time, they began to associate approval with control and affection with compliance. As adults, they carry an invisible contract into relationships, one where they must constantly prove their worth through stability, detachment, or silence. Their fear is not simply of intimacy, but of the cost of it. They've learned that love often arrives with strings attached, expectations lurking just beneath the surface, ready to tighten as soon as they begin to relax. The kind of love that an avoidant person will begin to trust is the love that breaks this unspoken contract. It is love that requires nothing but their presence, love that doesn't need them to show up a certain way, offer constant reassurance, or modulate themselves to make the other person feel secure. This love does not use guilt, flattery, or dependency to extract behavior. It allows them to exist exactly as they are, in whatever emotional state they happen to be in, without the burden of performance. Such love is rare, and when they first encounter it, they may not recognize it as love at all. They may even distrust it, waiting for the moment when the demand will surface, when the emotional transaction will be made explicit. But as the love remains steady, as it shows up consistently, without attempting to mold or manipulate, something inside the avoidant begins to shift. They notice that there is no price being asked, no expectation to entertain or emotionally please. They do not have to be expressive to be appreciated, nor do they need to constantly manage the emotional climate of the relationship. They can be quiet, they can retreat, they can forget to respond. And, still, the love does not evaporate. This begins to form a new blueprint in their psyche, a map where love is not a performance stage but a place of rest. In the stillness of this love, their nervous system begins to relax. They begin to understand, not just intellectually but somatically, that love can exist outside of transaction. That love can be a presence, not a pressure. They may still pull back at times, still doubt, still test the edges of that safety, but something foundational has begun to shift. They see that it's possible to be valued without packaging themselves. That being loved for simply being, without the need to entertain, achieve, or appease, is not only possible but real. And in that realization they begin to trust, not all at once, but in subtle, profound increments. It's this kind of love, free of performance, that reaches them where words never could, reminding them they are enough even in stillness, even in silence, even in their rawest, most unedited form. The avoidant personality is not shaped by a desire to escape love, but by a deep-rooted fear of what love has historically meant, loss of control, emotional enmeshment, and vulnerability that led to pain. They often carry an internal world where fear is the dominant compass, though it rarely shows on the surface. This fear doesn't always scream or cry. Sometimes it appears as detachment, aloofness, or excessive independence. But beneath these surfaces lies an emotional history saturated with experiences where expressing needs was either punished or ignored. For the avoidant, fear is not an occasional emotion, but a constant background noise that shapes how they perceive connection. It's not that they don't want closeness, it's that closeness has always come with a cost too high to pay. And so they protect themselves, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. When love comes near with intensity, urgency, or emotional demand, the avoidant's defenses rise reflexively. They do not trust love that fears their distance, that reacts anxiously when they pull back, or that interprets their need for solitude as a threat. Love that flinches at their emotional rhythm only confirms their deepest fear, that closeness will rob them of peace. But when love meets their fear with calm presence, with patience instead of panic, something different begins to unfold. Love that does not shrink in the presence of fear becomes something they can actually begin to feel safe within. It sees the flinching, the withdrawal, the silence, and instead of chasing or correcting it, it simply remains. It doesn't dramatize their retreat or punish their need to be alone. It says, without words, "You are still safe here." In that kind of emotional atmosphere, the avoidant begins to experience something rare and disorienting, safety in their own fear. They learn that love can coexist with distance, that it can still remain even when they can't articulate what they're feeling. Most of all, they learn that love does not require them to banish their fear before being accepted. When someone can honor their fear rather than fear it themselves, the avoidant feels, perhaps for the first time, that their emotional experience won't be weaponized against them. They don't have to explain their silence, nor defend their need for space. Their inner complexity is not treated as a failure, but simply as a facet of who they are. This acceptance becomes the seed of transformation. When they no longer need to hide their fear to preserve the relationship, they can begin to integrate it. The love that survives their fear, that doesn't run from it or try to eliminate it, becomes the only kind of love they can trust. It shows them that they are not a project to be fixed, nor a problem to be solved. They are seen and accepted within their own emotional language, without translation or shame. Over time, the fear begins to soften, not because it was eradicated, but because it was no longer feared. And in that rare, steady light, the avoidant finally begins to step forward. Avoidant individuals have spent much of their emotional lives carefully controlling how they are perceived. They learned early that revealing too much invited judgment, pressure, or manipulation. As a result, they developed an intuitive radar for the emotional motives of others, often sensing when affection is tied to unspoken expectations. They are not indifferent. They are hyper-aware, tuned to the subtle cues that indicate they are being nudged, persuaded, or subtly coerced. This constant vigilance shapes the way they receive love. They don't reject closeness because they're incapable of it, but because closeness has often meant the loss of their emotional sovereignty. They fear being changed, reshaped, or absorbed into someone else's emotional narrative. So when love comes with an agenda, no matter how well-intentioned, they recoil. They sense the magnetism of manipulation, even if it's masked in care, concern, or spiritual language. What they can begin to trust, however, is a love that mirrors instead of manipulates. This kind of love offers reflection, not redirection. It holds up a clear image of who they are without distortion or demand. It does not try to improve or fix them, nor does it require them to be emotionally available on cue. The avoidant finds comfort in this neutrality because it does not make them feel like a project under construction. Instead of being pulled into someone else's emotional agenda, they are allowed to remain centered in their own experience. The mirror simply shows what is, without commentary. In this space, they begin to feel something they rarely experience in relationships: emotional freedom. They are not being drawn into an emotional vortex. They are not being asked to perform emotional labor or to meet an invisible standard of closeness. They are being allowed to see themselves as they are, not as someone else wants them to be. Such love does not vanish when the avoidant withdraws, nor does it erupt with need when the avoidant stays distant. It remains steady, grounded, and accepting, not because it lacks depth, but because it respects the sacredness of another's internal process. In this kind of presence, the avoidant begins to slowly test the safety of the connection. They offer small glimpses of vulnerability, not to meet someone else's need, but because they feel safe enough to choose it. They begin to understand that love doesn't have to pull, it can simply reflect. And when love reflects without agenda, it affirms their identity rather than threatening it. Over time, this mirroring allows the avoidant to explore emotional connection at their own pace. They begin to trust that they are not being emotionally colonized, that their autonomy remains intact. They don't have to constantly manage someone else's response or explain their inner world. The love that mirrors gives them the space to emerge on their own terms, and in that spaciousness they find a kind of trust that feels real, not based on pressure or performance, but rooted in mutual respect. It is within this reflection that the avoidant finally feels safe enough to be fully seen. Avoidant individuals often operate from the deep belief that their presence in someone's life is conditional, that they are loved only when they are visible, useful, or emotionally available. This belief is not born from arrogance, but from wounds often inflicted during formative years when affection was inconsistent or came attached to conditions. Because of this, avoidants feel the need to test love not through conscious manipulation, but through emotional disappearance. They vanish emotionally, sometimes physically, to observe whether the connection was built on who they truly are or on who they were expected to be. Disappearance becomes a defense mechanism, a subconscious way of asking, "Will you still hold love for me when I am no longer performing for it?" This disappearance is not an act of cruelty, but a silent, desperate inquiry into the durability of the bond. In their world, absence becomes the only true measure of presence. They are observing whether love collapses without their performance, or whether it endures without expectation. Most people panic in this gap, becoming reactive or resentful, interpreting the withdrawal as rejection, indifference, or punishment. But the love that an avoidant can begin to trust is the one that survives the silence. It doesn't chase, accuse, or demand. It waits, not in bitterness but in quiet confidence. It does not see their vanishing act as a betrayal, but as a language of protection, of testing, of trying to find safety in the only way they know how. The avoidant returns not when forced, but when they sense that their disappearance has not broken the structure of love. When they come back and find that the connection hasn't been drowned in anxiety or eroded by pressure, they begin to trust that the love is real. This kind of love is incredibly rare because it requires maturity, emotional regulation, and self-respect from the one who holds it. It doesn't collapse into fear, nor does it try to force understanding. It holds steady boundaries without closing the door. It says, "I'm still here, even if you're not ready right now." And in doing so, it gives the avoidant something they have almost never experienced, the freedom to return without shame. When they re-enter the relationship and find no anger waiting at the door, no emotional tally of their absence, They begin to feel what safety actually means. Not emotional indulgence, not chaos disguised as passion, but true emotional reliability. They learn that love can remain still even when they move away, that their worth isn't in what they give or how constantly they show up, but simply in who they are, even when they disappear. Over time, this survival of love through absence becomes the ultimate proof. Not that they will always need to retreat, but that they no longer have to. That the love can hold their silence, their doubts, their rhythms, and still remain whole. And for the avoidant, that is the first time love has ever felt safe enough to trust. The avoidant heart does not fear love itself. It fears what love has come to represent in their past: control, judgment, obligation, and the slow erosion of self. They do not push away because they feel nothing. They push away because they feel too much, and do not know how to carry it. The only kind of love they will ever trust is not loud, insistent, or urgent. It is calm, steady, and quiet enough to hold space for all the parts they've hidden from the world. It does not demand entry, but waits at the threshold. It does not flinch when met with silence or recoil in the face of fear. It does not try to fix, perform, or manipulate. It simply remains, anchored, open, and free. And in that still, unwavering presence, the avoidant finds the one thing they've never truly known: a love that doesn't require them to become someone else in order to belong. And when they find it, they don't just trust it. They begin finally to return to it.